Hey guys, Steve Wise here, president and founder of Mental Fitness LLC. Today's video is a long one. This is a full half hour, 45-minute training. I'm not even sure how long this is gonna go, but we're gonna do it on deaths of despair. I know it's not the most uplifting subject in the world, but the fact is, for the past 3 years in a row, life expectancy has gone down. This is the first time that life expectancy has gone down for 3 years in a row in 100 years. And this was even before the coronavirus came. You have to go back 100 years to 1915 to 1918, the Spanish flu, that life expectancy went down for 3 years in a row. The question that I want to explore today in this video is why? Why is life expectancy decreasing in the United States despite improvements in medical technology? So here's the deal, guys. If you are going to watch this video, please watch it in its entirety. It's going to be anywhere from a half an hour to 45 minutes long. I have the next hour to film this. I want to go over deaths of despair and their causes. It's essentially a free training, and I want everybody to know it because I want people to know what's really going on and where it's coming from. So get comfy, grab some popcorn. I hope that this video will be very educational, interesting. I'm gonna throw in some of my opinions. I'm gonna throw in a whole bunch of facts. I'm gonna throw in some references. I hope you learned something. So get comfy, and here we go. When we look at deaths of despair, in 2017, we had 158,000 deaths of despair. This is a lot. When we break down those numbers, they look like this: 70,000 overdoses, 47,000 suicides, 41,000 alcoholic liver disease deaths. When we look historically, even as of 5 years ago, car accidents hover around 40,000. They're down a little bit. Historically, overdoses and suicides have always been less than car accidents. But in the past 5 years, that's changed. And now, suicides and overdoses have been such extreme outliers in the numbers that it's driving down our overall life expectancy. This made me ask the question, why? Why do we have so many overdoses? Where is this coming from? And I would look at New York Times articles. I would see that overprescribing is an issue. I would see that, that certain other things are issues. Fentanyl is an issue, right? All of these things, and I get little snippets of the story, but nobody yet had looked at the whole comprehensive story, the whole George R.R. Martin Game of Thrones saga of deaths of despair and life expectancy, and what we can do to improve it. So this can be part one of 2 videos. Today, I want to just shed light on the problem. I want you to know that this is happening and perhaps give you some theories, 4 parts of them, maybe about 15 theories as to what is driving life expectancy down in the United States. So getting right into it, let's look at part 1. Here's some of the first arguments I've heard and that I want to talk about: personal responsibility, genetics, and stigma. The personal responsibility argument is this: it's survival of the fittest. It's nobody's killing these people. Nobody's injecting them with heroin. Nobody's making them commit suicide. This is survival of the fittest. Let them die. I don't even like saying that out loud. I disagree with that argument quite strongly. But then the counter to this argument is, this is their fault. This is their responsibility. They had a shot. I had a shot. Everybody had an equal shot. Why should I feel bad? I don't believe that fundamental premise is correct. I don't think we are all born with equal shots. There's a great YouTube video where it's a race and a sprint race, but the starting line is staggered based on how many protective factors you have in your life. And the more protective factors you have in your life, the more you get a head start in the race. And I think that's actually quite an accurate interpretation of how the world is. So the challenge with the personal responsibility argument is this: it falls short in that it doesn't account for the fundamental attribution error. And that is basically When I see somebody who's successful, I tend to give credit to their circumstances. We all do. But when I have personal success, we tend to give credit to ourselves. And vice versa for failing. If I see somebody else fail, I think, man, they failed. That's on them. If I fail myself, I think, man, I had really tough circumstances. We just do this naturally as part of our psychology. It protects our sense of self. The challenge is it's overly simplistic and it's not fundamentally correct. The same could be said for the personal responsibility argument, right? We think that addiction doesn't discriminate. Addiction does discriminate. It very much discriminates. If there was no discrimination across addiction, it would be completely random. And it is not that. There are very clear risk factors like trauma and other things, and there are very clear protective factors. So when we look at that, the personal responsibility argument is embraced by so many, I believe, because it's simple and it makes sense and it gives us a sense of control. And it's easier to think that we have a sense of control over something and easier to blame and to think of a simplistic story than it is to do the harder work of looking at the person's whole environment. So the last thing I'll mention here at this point is this. My first book, Mental Fitness, was all about the mindset of personal resiliency, how to thrive and how to master your thinking to master your life. And I stand by everything I say in that book. The challenge is, if I talk with somebody about better dieting, for example, and I talk with them till I'm blue in the face and I give them all the education in the world of how to have a really good diet, right? Eat real food, not too much, mostly plants. We talk about that. If they go home and their home only has Dollar General and McDonald's, what are they likely to eat? And that's what I kept running up against as an individual therapist. I can work with individuals, but if I'm not working to change things on a macro level, I'm not working to change the community as a whole, then I am not achieving my full potential. And so I realize that some of you are going to disagree with some of the things I say. I realize that we're all going to have different views on this. I don't want to just be someone who sits behind a computer screen and complains on social media. I want to take action. I want to write a book. I want to get politically involved, even though that sucks. Everything about it sucks. I want to advocate. I want to educate. I want to speak. I want to do these things that step it up from an individual level to a macro community level. And that's the whole goal of this entire free training. Checking in on the Americans we've left out to do exactly that. So that's point one. That's personal responsibility. I think it's mostly mythical, and it's an overly simplistic argument that doesn't actually look at the environment of the person, but puts too much fault on the person, his or herself. Second one, genetics. This is the argument that, somebody has parents who are alcoholics, and therefore they have the alcoholic gene, and they're likely to be an alcoholic, and there's nothing you can do. Genetics are, predetermine our life. And while there's maybe some truth to this, it is grossly overstated. And again, it's because it's a simplistic viewpoint, and I think it kind of feeds into our for-profit medical system. We say that, depression's lacking serotonin. Well, all right, that's probably better than a moral failure, but then we throw a pill at it that helps improve serotonin. And the real story is it's a lot more complex than that. There's probably about 9 causes of depression that Johann Hari argues. And the throw a pill at it because it's a serotonin imbalance is ridiculously simplistic. So when we look at genetics, most genetics come from twin studies. The thing about twin studies is they're garbage. I think twin studies should be malpractice, because let's think about the fundamental premise of twin studies, right? Let's say I'm born in Pittsburgh and I have a biological twin, but we are separate at birth, and I have a biological twin who's raised in St. Louis and I'm raised in Pittsburgh. Twin studies will say, oh, what a fortunate way to study whether it's someone's environment or genetics that makes them similar. And they would associate then the similarities between us and give it a genetic causality and say, well, they were born the same but reared in different environments, their similarities must be genetic. Wait a second. I don't think I agree with that, because if I have a twin who looks just like me but was raised in St. Louis, is it that we're similar because we share genetic makeup? Or is it because that we look similar and the world treated us similarly? I believe more in the latter. I think that's more of the reason behind the efficacy of twin studies. And I think the fundamental premise is kind of broken, and most of them are largely invalid, and kind of feed our for-profit medical system that throws a pill at things to correct a genetic imbalance, more so than doing the harder work of looking at the environment the person is in. Third reason here, stigma. The fact is that 1 in 10 people seeking addiction treatment get adequate, proper addiction treatment. What that means is 9 out of 10 people struggling with an addiction are not getting adequate, appropriate treatment. They're getting no treatment or less than adequate treatment. When we hear the numbers on the ROI of treatment, it drives you crazy when you know that investing $1 in treatment saves 12 in public-related health costs from HIV, Hep C, and overdoses, and saves another, maybe it saves $7 there and another $5 in criminal costs, court costs, lawyer fees, all of these other things. It's like, why are we not investing more in treatment? I'd rather spend a dime than save $1, and yet that's not what we're doing. And the fact that only 1 out of 10 people get treatment is not only a failure of how we provide treatment and barriers to accessibility of treatment, but also just a failure of the way in which we regard addiction. I think about Suboxone versus antidepressants. And I think if I am struggling with depression and I go see a doctor for an antidepressant, I'm pretty easily gonna get a script and be able to fill that at an affordable price pretty quickly. Not much hassle. Because we say that depression is a serotonin imbalance and we largely have made it medical. On the other side, we say that addiction, let's say opioid addiction, it's an endorphin deficiency, right? Same thing as a serotonin deficiency, but is it just as easy to get Suboxone? No, not at all. You have to go to a specialized doctor, not a PCP. There are wait lists sometimes in which people die on the wait list. There are observed urine screens, there's pre-authorization, there's weekly counseling, there's weekly medication visits, there's a copay, there's dirty looks at the pharmacy. The pharmacy doesn't always have the formulation that you need. I could go on, but all of those come at a time and a cost that keep people out of treatment that really need it. And so when we look at it, it boils down to this. We treat depression as medical, we treat addiction as criminal. And until we look at addiction as truly a medical issue, we are going to continue to fail. So, stigma. There is no shame in getting help. It should be as easy to get help for addiction treatment as it is for depression or anxiety, and I hope that our society gets there. That's part 1. Part 2, the opioid epidemic. I could speak for hours on this, and yet I'm gonna try to cap it here at maybe about 10 minutes. But when we look at the opioid epidemic, what we see is that these numbers have just gone up in crazy amounts. In Allegheny County in 1998, I think there was something like 48 overdoses. In 2014, it broke 300 for the first time. In 2014, it broke 400 for the first time. That's a 10 times increase from 98 to 2014. And I think some of the more recent numbers are at 675 overdoses in Allegheny County. And it just makes me think, like, how do we go up tenfold plus from 1998 to 2014 to where we're at now? And it's not getting better with the accessibility of fentanyl and other drugs. So we definitely have an epidemic. There's no denying that. Why do we have an epidemic? Well, let's take a look. I have a worksheet with me here so I don't miss any of the really, really important points. And one of the points that I really want to emphasize is this, and this is that we think about addiction all wrong. Johann Hari wrote an excellent book called Chasing the Scream, in which he references work by Bruce Alexander and more specifically the Rat Park Study. If you're not familiar with the Rat Park Study, you should be, because the Rat Park Study is this. Back around the turn of the 20th century, 1900, there was experiments done with rats. And they would give rats two levers in a box and give them a choice between food or cocaine or heroin. And then they'd get hooked on the cocaine or heroin, and then they'd say, hey rat, you get one choice for the day. You want to take your supply of food and survive? Do you want to take your supply of heroin or cocaine? The rat would get fixated on the heroin or cocaine, and even, until it starved itself to death. So the argument from that is, oh hey, these drugs have powerful chemical hooks, and they're not to be messed around with. And Bruce Alexander came around in 1970. He's a Canadian guy, I believe, and he's like, well, yeah, okay, well, all right, hard to argue that, but if I were alone in a box, there's not much else to do, man. Like, right? What else are you gonna do? Do drugs? It's kind of a crap existence, right? Isolation hits pain in the brain. Like, let's switch up this experiment a little bit. So Bruce Alexander does the rat park study, which is basically like heaven for rats, right? And he gives them a lush environment with spin wheels and play toys, and they have socialization, and they have sex, and they have 2 water bottles. And at first, they're both just water bottles, but then he laces one with heroin or cocaine. If you do that to a rat alone in a box, it gets fixated on the drug-laced water bottle until it dies. But in Rat Park, they mostly shunned the drug-laced water bottle. In fact, they consumed it 75% less, and none of them died. And even if you take if you get a rat who grows up in Rat Park, get it addicted to drugs alone in a box, and then you give it a choice between its drug in isolation or returning to socialization without its drug, it chooses Rat Park. Addiction is largely a bonding issue. I'm gonna say that again. Addiction is largely a bonding issue. But what does the war on drugs do to people when we make drug possession a felony? We throw people in jail at the cost of $35,000 a year. They then have a felony on the record. How are they going to reintegrate into society? How are they going to bond with a sense of meaning and purpose in work? How are they going to bond with others who are now stigmatizing them? They're likely not. They're likely to return to a bond with their drug and likely to return to jail, die, or commit crime. It is a sad and vicious cycle that the war on drugs largely creates a war for drugs, right? Think about it. During Prohibition, right? We didn't stop drinking. There's always going to be a demand for drugs. There was just no legal supply. So there was an illegal supply. And you didn't know what you were getting. There was no regulation, right? There were moonshiners, there were speakeasies. And not that the regulated system we have now with alcohol is perfect, but you don't see any moonshiners anymore. Not really anyways, because we have a legal regulated system. But with drugs like heroin and other opiates, you have Mexican cartels fighting over street corners. You know what happens anytime there's a huge drug bust? Murder rates go up. The demand doesn't go away, but the established hierarchy needs reset in that area, so people kill each other to regain that street corner. The war on drugs creates a war for drugs. It is completely backwards. And it creates a society that makes addicts feel more like they're that rat alone in Rat Park than one that says, we welcome you back into society. Let's give you a bonding and a sense of meaning and purpose through education, job incentive programs, treatment. It does the opposite. So when we look at the epidemic, there are many factors here playing in. There is our for-profit medical system, which is all reactive and not at all proactive. And, I bill insurance companies for some of the counseling services that I do. And I see my reimbursement rate. I see, people's co-pays. I see their deductibles. I know what they pay or their employer pays. And I see that, healthcare costs have just been rising. And that's a burden to employers. It's a burden to families. It's conditional on work. It's a burden all around. And then I see, the CEO of United makes $77,000 a day. That's a lot of money for a medical provider to make per day. And it just makes me wonder, in our for-profit system, without checks on regulating prescription price. Our medical system is not a free market. It's not. There are patents and then reformulations of medications to get new patents. That's exactly what oxycodone did when it became OxyContin. When Purdue Pharma was going to lose its patent, let's make it continuous release and extend our patent. And let's bribe doctors and let's give a whole bunch of misinformation through free training to say that our product is virtually non-addictive. And you know what happened when Big Pharma and Purdue misled doctors? We got a generation of people addicted to opioids. And they were fined $600 million. Pretty substantial, right? The Sackler family, Purdue Pharma fined $600 million. Challenge is, it's 2%. It's a 2% fine. It's a slap on the wrist. Meanwhile, there have been more opiates prescribed for people in Ohio. There have been more opiates prescribed for the state of Ohio than there are people in Ohio, right? In 2014, there were 200 million opioid prescriptions written. There's only 330 million people in the US. That's enough to give everybody a dose of hydrocodone multiple times a day for a month. Everyone in the United States. That's the role that Big Pharma has played. But Big Pharma got a lot of things working for their advantage. One is DTC, direct-to-consumer advertising. And this is that Big Pharma can advertise on TV. We see the commercials all the time, right? There's some sort of graduation going on in the background or something like that, and some nice soothing music as they list all of these crazy side effects. But the fact is, they can advertise directly to us. We, the United States and Papua New Guinea, are the only two developed countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer advertising. And for me, what this does is it creates an artificial need. It says, hey, you feeling a little sad and lonely? You feeling a little blue? You just watched all those commercials that encouraged you to buy stuff you don't have? We have a pill for that. And it creates an artificial need that isn't really there. And it's why we are such a medicated society. We're not taught that emotions are our GPS system and they're teaching us if actions are out of line with a value and how to course correct. We're not taught that. We're taught emotions are bad. Numb them out. Direct-to-consumer advertising does not help our cause in that regard. Overprescribing is ridiculous. I even think of direct-to-consumer advertising with Joe Camel, right? Joe Camel's used and we get a generation of people hooked on cigarettes, specifically kids. It's good. Cigarette rates are going down. This is good. Less people are smoking. That's awesome. What happens? Vaping comes around. And who advertises for vaping? Jenny McCarthy. Now, I'm in my mid-30s. I remember Jenny McCarthy from Singled Out. You know, she was then and is perhaps still now a sex symbol and a good-looking woman who is advertising for nicotine on television. Who does that appeal to? Did we not learn our lesson from Joe Camel? Now we just pivot and we allow vaping, and now we have a generation of young people again hooked on nicotine but called vaping, and we advertise it on TV? How does this happen? How do we not learn our lessons? Sorry, I get a little amped up about that one. Trauma. Here's the thing about trauma. Trauma's a real one. If some others are myths, trauma's a real one when it comes to why we have deaths of despair and increased overdoses. Trauma, and the higher your trauma level as measured by ACE scores, adverse childhood events, the more trauma you have, trauma is more highly correlated with addiction than obesity is to heart disease. I'm gonna say that again to let that sit in. Trauma is more strongly correlated with addiction, meaning the more trauma and the higher level of it you have, the more likely you are to be addicted. Trauma is a better predictor of addiction than obesity, and the amount of weight you have is a predictor of heart disease. So I gotta tell you the story of the grieving mongoose. I gotta do it. There's a mated pair of mongoose in the wild, right? And in their environment, they have access to intoxicating herbs and mushrooms, but they mostly shun them. They have each other. They're bonded. Then one day a mudslide comes and kills one of the mongoose. What does the remaining mongoose do? It goes intoxicating herb eating crazy. And that's what we see in our lives right now. That the more trauma we have, the more likely we're gonna be to use illicit substances. When I meet with someone, and I meet with them for the first time, and I hear that they're struggling with an addiction, and then I hear their story, my most often thought is, oh my goodness, I can't believe you're doing as well as you were. If I were in your shoes, I don't think I'd be thriving nearly as much as you are, not let alone surviving. I get it. It makes sense. I hear their whole story. Trauma is a big part of this story, and one that we should all be better aware of. And that, my friends, is part 2. This is the epidemic that we're seeing and why these numbers are going up. So let's look here at the economy, part 3. When we look at investing in treatment, we should be doing this. As I mentioned, every dollar in treatment, according to NIDA, the National Institute of Drugs of Abuse and Alcohol, says, I'm not making up a statistic, for every dollar we spend in treatment, we save 12 in criminal and court costs. And we think sometimes that, like, from an economic perspective, okay, it costs maybe 26 cents to make a pack of cigarettes. That might be a dated statistic, but it can't be much more than that. And we charge $8-10, right? And a lot of that is a sin tax, and that comes to the state. That's great for revenue, right? So, okay, no harm, no foul. We're getting money from it. Yeah, we have to spend money, but we're getting money from it. This is a wash? No, it's not a wash at all. For every dollar we collect from revenue from cigarette smoking, we spend 10 in public-related health costs. The real cost of a pack of cigarettes should be $80 to $100 if we wanted to actually get enough tax revenue to cancel out the ramifications that come from cigarette smoking. And when we look at these numbers, yeah, 158,000 deaths of despair is a lot. So is 450,000 smoking-related diseases every year. And I'm not even talking about that one. Even though all of these are all tied together, right? Because if you're miserable in life, you might smoke. If you love life, you're probably not going to tolerate that. So let's really get to the economy here. When we look at the economy, what we are seeing is that we have an economy in which my concern is that capitalism is running a bit amok. That we are looking at statistics like unemployment, which until the pandemic recently was at a historic low, GDP, which until the pandemic recently was at a historic high. And we're thinking these are good numbers, and they are. They're not bad numbers by any means. But the real number to consider is labor force participation rate. The fact is, disability rates have actually been skyrocketing in recent years. And nobody's really talking about this. But the challenge is we have more people now on disability, which is essentially the same as long-term unemployment, but with a disability tag to it that says, I am disabled, which is terrible for one's psychology, and that 99% of people never get off of. I wish that statistic weren't true. But once you're on disability, people tend not to get off of it. And I get it. I get why, right? If it's like, I think I can work, but I'm not sure, but if I try, I'm going to lose my entire safety net, there is a disincentive for even trying. So we have more people on disability right now than we have in all of the field of construction, right? And when we look at the economy, what we see happening is that over the past, since maybe like 1980, we've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, 4 million to automation, 1 million to outsourcing. That hurts. What else have we seen increases in? We've seen increases in the price of healthcare. We've seen increases in the price of housing, and we've seen increases in the price of education. We've also seen the rise of Amazon. Now, Amazon pays 0 in federal taxes. 0. Not a dime, right? But the challenge is local malls are closing to the point where it's been called retail apocalypse, right? And what happens when a local mall closes? Well, revenue from that mall, taxes, used to go to the state, the government, and we're not getting that anymore. The security guard no longer has a job. The food court is no longer in existence. The mall itself becomes blight, which is a form of negative infrastructure, which lowers the property value of all the surrounding areas. And what we have then is communities that have Walmart as their major business and or some for-profit medical system. We don't see the commerce that we used to have. And what was hitting our factories is now hitting our main streets. And basically, when we look at deaths of despair, it is largely affecting people with a bachelor's degree or less. that seems to be a dividing line where if you have a bachelor's degree, you're still doing okay. If you don't have a bachelor's degree, and specifically you're a white male between 45 and 54, this is where we're seeing huge increases in this population of deaths of despair that is driving down the number for the whole. And a lot of that comes from job displacement, which then hurts our whole community when we have Amazon not paying taxes and creating retail apocalypse. And we have education costs that are skyrocketing. The average student loan debt is $38,000. $38,000, right? That's a crap ton of money. There's no other way to put it. So we have millennials who own 3% of the nation's wealth at an average age of 31, and we have boomers who own 57% of the nation's wealth. But when boomers were 35 years old, they owned 21% of the nation's wealth, 7 times more than the average millennial has right now. Now, do millennials have their faults? I'm a millennial. Sure, yeah, right? We all have our faults. We're maybe, more entitled and don't want to work our way up the ladder. But at the same time, when we think of that starting line analogy that I started this topic with, if you're starting with 3% of the nation's wealth versus 21% of the nation's wealth as an entire cohort, that's really tough. Because not only are we starting off life and with $38,000 on average as debt, but then it's to get an entry-level job, which suspends getting married, it suspends buying a home, and it really hurts the economy as a whole. The education bubble needs to burst. It is no longer worth the bang for the buck that it used to be. And the challenge is, though, if we don't have it, job prospects and life prospects aren't nearly as good. But my concern is, whereas it used to be that somebody who didn't have a college education could get a good manufacturing job, my future concern is even people with bachelor's degrees, if it's not in a more advanced degree, a master's degree or a PhD or a doctorate or something, are also going to fall into job displacement as automation continues to rise. In my next video, I'm going to throw out some potential solutions for this, but right now I just want you to be aware of the problems. So the challenges with healthcare on the rise, with housing costs on the rise, and with education on the rise, we are seeing people in kind of some economic despair. And when we look at the really extreme ends of that, those ends get exaggerated in a big way that hurt us all. In Seattle, the bottom 1% of socioeconomic status commit 20% of the crime. With new work, we are not seeing new work that is with benefits for the most part. We are seeing 94% of new work is gig work, meaning it comes as part-time without benefits on a contracted rate and basis, which is when the job is done. This is really scary, this statistic here, because healthcare has become such a burden on the back of employers that employers can't afford to give healthcare to their employees, and so they become contractors. And this is not good either. So our whole economy is really not great at the moment, to the point where even with a bachelor's degree, 40% of people with a bachelor's degree are underemployed, meaning they have the degree, but they're working as a bartender or in retail or some job that doesn't necessarily require the degree they got. So we see 40% of people with a bachelor's degree underemployed, and we see that when we look at stock prices, which is how we measure often the health of our economy rather than labor force participation rate, which is at 62.9%, which is on par with El Salvador. It's not as high as other developed countries. That's the stat we probably should be looking at. What we see instead is that when we look at GDP and unemployment as headline, how are we doing economically? The stock market is really only a reflection of people who own stock. And back in 2013, the bottom 80% of people only owned 8% of the stock in the world. So the stock market, while maybe great and is concerning right now if it's going down because of the coronavirus pandemic for somebody like my parents who have saved their life and have some of their retirement in stock, and that's taking a big hit right now, and that's really important, and that is drastically affecting boomers who own stock. It's not so much a reflection of maybe the average person who makes $31,099 a year and over 50% of people can't afford a $500 unexpected medical bill. These concerns in our economy are real, and they're not getting better. And I think we're starting to see a lot of gaps in our system because of this coronavirus pandemic. And it's showing the gaps in our healthcare system. It's showing the gaps in our economy and where safety nets are falling short. And guys, that's part 3. The economic despair that plays into this as well, especially for manufacturing towns where manufacturing isn't there anymore. And we have people who, I even think of like truck drivers as trucks become automated here in the next several years. The average truck driver is a 49-year-old male with health conditions. It's gonna be hard to retrain, it's gonna be hard to replace, to reposition that person. And that's a scary picture when there's 3.5 million truckers right now. We need to do something proactively, I would argue, to prevent this from being disastrous, to cushion the blow now, as opposed to waiting and being reactive. So, part 4 is the community. I'm going to continue to stand over here. And what we're seeing with this is also concerning. What we are seeing is that, I think the average cost of a home is over $200,000. It might be even $250,000. But what we're seeing is that floor space is going up, but close friends are going down. Technology has us connected to our phones, but we're not connecting in person. Church attendance is down. Kids playing in the neighborhood with one another is down. It seems to be more arranged play dates. And the news media kind of has us convinced that bad stuff's happening all around. And the news media has incentive for that, because if they present negative news and then hijacks our amygdala and their goal is ratings, we're gonna watch it. But it's not necessarily a reflection of what's actually happening in the world. There's a lot of good in the world. But the challenge is our communities are not considered our homes anymore. Our houses are being considered our homes, and we're becoming kind of more isolated and insulated that way. And the government doesn't help either, because we don't trust our government to help us either. We have resentment for paying taxes. We don't trust that politicians have good intentions, and I don't trust politicians have good intentions. I'm no different there. The challenge is, without that trust, it's easy to fall into a sense of apathy, and that is, there's nothing I can do here. I am powerless. I can complain about it on social media. I can, have my own opinions and keep them in because I'm afraid to rub someone wrong by expressing them. Or we can do stuff. We can reach out to people and connect and check in on the ones we're concerned about. We can advocate for social justice and what we believe in and have civil conversations even with the people we disagree with. We can educate ourselves as to why is life expectancy going down and why are deaths of despair on the rise. We can explore different ways as to how our economy could work more for us rather than us being an input in the wheel. We can think about how can we reallocate funds to get a return on investment to lower addiction numbers, to better destigmatize and treat mental health. We can think about maybe doing the harder work of looking at that person's whole story, their whole environment, and not the simplistic blame game that we so often see. Guys, I wrote an entire book on the personal resiliency of thinking, and I truly believe if you master your thinking, you can master your life. My next challenge is going to be to advocate on a more macro community level, to make suggestions as to how we can improve these things, these pains, and to make life happier for us. I truly believe if you're happy, you're successful. And I want to help improve happiness and wellness and life expectancy. And I want people to know stats like trauma being correlated with addiction, and for every $1 we spend in treatment, we save 12. And I want people to know the Rat Park study, and I want people to see the trends in our society and where we're headed, and if we like the direction we're headed. And so I hope that this video has helped you learn some of those things. I'm gonna do another video on proposed solutions, how I think we can, improve some of these things. But in the meantime, I would just encourage you, especially during this pandemic, check in with the people you think might be at risk. Reach out, offer a listening ear, take the time to educate yourself, take the time to, be active politically for social justice, whatever it is. There's a lot more that you as an individual can do than you're even giving yourself credit for. When we think somebody ought to change the world, I believe that someone is you. And I thank you for watching this video.